All right. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're joining us from, and welcome to another edition of Spring Office Hours. I'm your host, Dan Vega, and with me, as always, is my good friend, DaShaun Carter. How are you, DaShaun?
Wonderful. I'm wonderful. It's a great day to be a Spring developer.
And yeah, we were part of a nice panel discussion today about what's new in Spring Boot 3. That was a lot of fun, along with our coworker, Nate Shuda. So we got to talk a lot about Spring Boot 3 and just having some conversations internally. It looks like we're going to be doing a lot more of that in the next 2 months. So looking forward to that.
How are you today?
I'm good. I'm a little tired. We were talking before the show. My daughter, who is a little over 2, has decided that she just doesn't want to sleep through the night anymore again. So she gets up and gets in our bed and then just doesn't get comfortable. And the whole night. So haven't been sleeping a lot lately, but it's part of the gig, I guess.
It is. I think you'll make it.
Yeah, I'll be okay. Look at you. Your office is looking really good here. Yes. I like it.
Baby steps. I realize I have to do something with these DVDs. People looking there like, are those DVDs? Baby steps. The office is still something new. I'm still kind of figuring out my way, but I'm happy.
Lighting looks good. Camera looks good. I like it.
Getting there. We are getting there.
Cool. So we have a fun show planned today. I guess we could kind of talk about the rest of the year really quick because it is that time of year. Holidays coming up. Obviously, we're here today. We have 2 more shows planned for the year. Next week, I think we're kind of continuing with the same thing that we're doing today. And then we have a special guest on the 20th? 20th. Special guest on the 20th, which
maybe
we could talk. Yeah. We could talk more about next week. And then that's it. I think that's it for the year. And we'll come back strong in January, but maybe only for a week. Who knows? We'll be at Code Mash the second week. So
maybe something live, remote.
Yeah, that would be really fun. We'll have to start thinking about that.
Yeah.
So we're planning out the rest of the year, starting with today. Today, if you saw the title, was Getting Started with Spring Boot. The reason we kind of came up with this one is because DaShaun and I are giving a workshop at said conference in January called Code Mash, which we'll talk more about. And this is a 4-hour workshop on how to learn Spring from the start. Like how would you learn Spring if you're just new to the Spring world? And so we're putting together a workshop on that. We've outlined our agenda, and we want to like build in public here and talk to you guys about it. Talk to the community. If you are new, what would you want to learn? What would you expect to learn as you're just getting started? So we have an agenda, and we're going to talk through what that workshop is going to look like. And then, as I said, we'll probably continue this next week with actually building some of the demo out so we could talk through some of that. So that's our plan today. Again, we have a big agenda, and then we can go through each like step of the way. We can start talking about each section, and then hopefully you guys have some questions about some of the things we're going to be talking about.
But let's make it interactive, right?
Yes,
we do have an
for sure.
agenda where we're trying to, we want to hear what you want to learn. We want to make this workshop, as good as it can be. But here, this is still Spring office hours. If you've got questions, ask them. But yeah, we're going to try to see if we can cover some of the bases. And sometimes it's a good idea to reset the baseline. Like, what are the things about Spring Boot 3, Spring Framework in general, that I haven't thought about in a while? Like maybe I've forgotten some of those good practices or better practices along the way. So yeah, maybe we can learn from you as well.
Yeah, and we're still learning every single day. So, all right. I think what we'll do then is we'll just get started right away. What I'll do is I'll jump into the calendar like we do each and every single week.
I'll say hi to everybody. Thank you for joining. Some people new. Hey, yeah, Spring Boot 2 is out, and you're just in time. You don't even have to mess with Spring Boot 2. You can jump right into Spring Boot 3, which is GA.
Yep.
Hello. Thank you for joining during sleep.
Yes.
Time.
Hello. Still watching in India. Love it.
Yes, indeed. Thank you all for joining.
Thank you so much. All right. So calendar, a little less hectic than last month. We had a lot going on last month. We are on the 6th here. So we have one release this week, which is tomorrow. Spring Tool Suite has a new release coming out. Just looking ahead to the rest of the month, we have Spring Framework 6.0.3 coming out next weekend. So again, Spring 6 comes out. We get the community starts using it. Bugs start getting filed. We start patching those as quick as possible. So this will be 6.0.3. And then in the following week, the last week that we're here, Spring Boot 3.0.1 comes out, which will include Spring Framework 6.0.3.
I'm looking forward to the Spring Cloud Data Flow. Hello, Trexner, Smith from Hungary. We got a question right away. Hey, should I use REST controller or better the generic, I think, web client? Or no, the generic controller. I understand now.
The act controller, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it depends, right? You want to grab that one real quick?
Yeah, like what are you doing in your controller? So if you're trying to serve up some kind of HTML, if you're using like a template engine and you want to return something like a time leaf template, then you're just using @controller. If you're returning JSON or XML, JSON by default, then just go ahead and use @REST controller. At the end of the day, if you look in @REST controller, it's just a composed annotation of @controller and we got some fun spam. And I can't remember what that is a composition of. I'd have to look, but there are two basically annotations that it's composed of. So using REST controller just uses controller underneath the hood. Let's get rid of that.
I think I'm on it.
Okay. So yeah, thanks for the question. The other big one coming next week is Spring Cloud Release 2022. There have been some milestone releases. I think last week was the last big milestone release of Spring Cloud, which is made up of all these projects. So really big release coming. Go ahead and take a look at that.
Check this out right here. Where'd it go? There you go. Let's talk about your tweet.
Let's do it.
Why don't you jump into that?
Let me pull this up. I was just talking to DaShaun about this during the kind of before the show. And it's amazing. Like sometimes I'm just like working on stuff and I throw stuff out there and I'm like, oh, like nobody cares about this. And here we are 600 likes later. People have responded to this tweet. So basically what I said was I often see Spring developers returning a response entity and not manipulating that response. So just, it's probably hard to see in this screenshot, but down here, we're just returning response entity.ok and then the result, which is a list of posts. So I often see people automatically go to that. And I said, if all you're doing is returning the body, just use the type as a return type. There's no need to return a response entity. If you're going to add headers or change the status, then go ahead and use the response entity. Looking back on this again, if I would have known it would have got this much traction, I probably would have been a little bit more careful about my word here. Don't do this. I meant more of I wouldn't recommend this. This isn't like a don't do. And as somebody put in the comments, if this is the worst thing in a worst defense in your code, then you're doing okay. It was just a thought. So again, for those who don't know, response entity is basically like, hey, we want to go ahead and change something. We want to add a header to the response. We want to change the status code. And I even mentioned if it's just the status code, we have the @response status annotation. So you could, I do this often where everything is returning a 200 except maybe my create method in a controller is going to return a 201 to say it was successfully like created, right? So I just add the @response status annotation to that method. But if you need to manipulate the response, that's why response entity works good. But again, I just see a lot of tutorials where people automatically use that instead of just returning the type. The other comment I saw a lot in this thread here in the comments was, doesn't it make more sense to use response entity just to be consistent? And I don't really get that one. Like, I don't need to return a response entity in every single method because the return type is different for everything. Like in one, I'm returning a list of posts. In another one, I'm returning maybe just a single post. In another one, like in a delete method, I'm returning void. In an update method, I'm returning the post that was updated. So I don't need to be consistent here because everything is different. There are different actions going on here. So yeah, that was my tweet. It was cool to see a lot of the comments and questions, and it just reminded me to have more of these discussions out in the open because I learned from you guys, and hopefully you're learning from me. So,
yep. And there's a difference in scope. The whole like, hey, consistency. If I'm making this a part of a public API, for example, maybe that response entity has different options, right? This example here, maybe not the case, but maybe on some endpoints, I want to say, hey, here's a 201 versus a 200 versus 400. You can have different things coming back from that same endpoint. And that might be a case where, yeah, it makes sense. But again, it depends, right? That's why the Spring team gives you those options.
Yeah, no, this is great. And the other use case for this was somebody said in the comments that, hey, I generate a lot of these off of like an open API spec. Again, fine. This wasn't like a hard rule. This was just kind of an observation. So take it with a grain of salt, if you will. Cool. Anything else going on here?
Somebody's asking for you to drop a Spring Boot 3 project.
Oh, nice. Yeah. I have a lot of stuff coming with Spring Boot 3. I, like everyone else, have been spending my time learning things. The observability API and just the observability changes throughout Spring Boot 3 and Spring Framework 6 has been something I've been diving into a lot lately. But yes, I have a lot of Spring Boot 3 stuff coming. Just need to find some time to get it out. Cool.
Yeah.
So anything else on the calendar?
I don't know if I said it. I'm looking forward to Spring Cloud Data Flow. I'm excited to get into Spring Cloud Data Flow, maybe here at the end of the month. But yeah, I'm definitely looking forward to that release and doing some cool things there.
Cool. See another question. Let's go ahead and grab this.
Oh yeah.
I have another question. If I want to add AutoWired and at service, IntelliJ says that the field injection is not recommended. Is it considered bad practice? Yeah, I would say bad practice, not recommended, for a lot of reasons. So
don't you have an article on this too?
I do have a video on this. I don't know if I have an article, but there is a video. So if you head over to youtube.com/@DanVega, there is a video on dependency injection and why constructor injection is the favored recommendation. There are just a couple things here. One, we want to use constructor injection. If you're using field injection, we're now using reflection. So if we go to write a test for this, like how are we going to mock something out? So say in your controller, you are pulling in like a repository or a service class, maybe that talks to a database. In a test, I'd probably want to mock this thing out. I don't want to have a full integration test. I'm just kind of testing the controller layer. So in that case, I mock out that service or that repository and mock those methods out. It's really hard to do with reflection. Now you're getting into like, how do I mock that out? There are some other things that I go to in the video, but yes, you should favor constructor or setter injection is okay too. I never use it. Again, with tools like IntelliJ, it just does it for me. And so I will create a new variable. I'll just say like private final post service, and then IntelliJ says, hey, this looks like something that you should create a constructor method for with an argument. And I go, okay, and it just doesn't come up and say, right?
Sorry.
So I would go that route. But yeah, go ahead and check that video out if you want.
Yeah, I just found it. I accidentally clicked on it. That's what you heard in the background. Just give me a sec. I'll put it in the little chat.
Hey guys, suggest me a good course for Spring Boot. Ooh, we may be able to help with this in about a month. But for right now,
stay tuned today.
Yeah, but for right now, let's talk about this stuff. Here, when we get to what we want to go through today, this is a workshop. This is what we think that in 4 hours we could teach you about Spring. And I think, we'll even share this document if you want a copy of it. I think knowing what we're going to go through and teach, maybe you could take this and, look for other courses that kind of teach something similar. I have a course on Spring. I have a couple courses on Spring, but at this point, they're all 2 and they're a little bit old at this point. So, yeah. So I don't have a particular course that I could suggest right now, but I will think about that.
There's lots of options. No, I don't have a favorite course, but pick one and get started. And I will say that just the guides on Spring.io and on the Tanzu Developer Center are a great way to start. Building something, I think, is a much, for me, and everybody learns different, but for me, building something is a much better way for me to learn versus the course. And find something that's interesting to you. Just pick some part that's interesting to you and build. That'll be my recommendation. There's tons of material on how to get started with Spring Boot.
Yeah, and I don't know if I'm allowed to say anything, so I'm not going to. I'm gonna side on the. I'm gonna be a little bit cautious here, but we may have something from within VMware coming at some point on that too. So that's all I'll say.
Did you address this one? Like, hey,
yeah,
you're starting right now. Yeah, start with.
Yeah, I think if you're not all the way into it yet, I would go ahead and switch over to 3.0, unless. Like if you are almost done with this course and you've put in the work and it's ready to go, maybe get that out first and then worry about upgrading to 3.0. But if you're just starting, then yeah, there isn't there. I don't think there's a ton stopping you from just moving to Spring Boot 3, and it might be more appealing to whoever's taking it if they hear like, oh, hey, this is the latest and greatest, right?
Hear me out. What if you build the course in Spring 2.7, and for the final chapter, you use the Spring Migrator and migrated to Spring Boot 3?
Yeah, there you go. Love that. Because you're gonna have a lot of people. You're gonna have a lot of people looking to do that soon. So,
Awesome. Let's dig in. We got a couple more questions here. Hey, what's your best roadmap to learn Spring? Start at spring.io.
Yep.
Go there.
Start at Spring.io, and that's on our agenda for today. We're going to go over that roadmap, and at least what we think, and we'll jump into that.
Let's pull that up. We're answering those questions right here. Let's pull up the agenda. This is what we think.
Yeah,
is a great way to learn.
I just want to get into a couple other things before we get into that. Do you want to take this one?
What is reactive programming support? It's kind of moving from the ask response kind of to a more functional paradigm where we can kind of streaming things, streaming methods. I don't really have a good short way of saying it. It's
moving away from blocking IO to non-blocking IO. It's a pretty good way to say it, because a lot of the traditional applications you build are going to talk to something else like a database or another service, and you got to call that thing, and then if it's intense computing, you got to wait for that response back. So we're just moving away from that paradigm and saying, hey, I'm going to let go of this thread and wait for a response instead of holding on to it.
Another component, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, of reactive programming is this concept of back pressure. If I'm asking Dan for content, Dan with back pressure, I say, hey, you know what? I'm busy. Don't ask me for another 5 minutes.
Yep.
And we can do that programmatically.
Cool. Okay, let me just mention a couple other things and then we'll get into this. Our colleague and friend Mario Gray has a new article on the Tanzu Developer Center. So if you're into Spring Boot 3 here, there's an observability in reactive Spring Boot. So really great article that walks you through what is this observability thing, what is Spring Boot 3, how do we put these two together. So go ahead and check this out. I want to mention two books. Cloud Native Spring in Action by Thomas Vitale. Look at This Forward by Josh Long. There's a nice quote here. Josh is just everywhere on the internet, DaShaun. We can't get away from him. He's just everywhere I look. Says this book is fantastic. It's brimming with valuable ideas, couched in evident, profound, experienced. I will be pointing people to this book for the foreseeable future. I just mentioned that because I saw Josh's quote on there, but I actually picked this book up and I started reading it, but then I saw the print was getting shipped to me. So now I'm waiting because I'm a big fan of print books. So I'm waiting to finish this off from the print version. But really great book so far. Looking forward to finishing this one. And then friend of the show / co-host of a couple of shows and guest, Greg Turnquist has a book coming out, Learning Spring Boot 3. That's now available for pre-order on Amazon. So go ahead and check this out.
Yeah, and I'll say this about Greg in the book. I feel like I've gotten to kind of watch along with the process. I like the way he thinks. I like the way he explains things. Everybody kind of has that person that says it the way that you want to hear it. And I get goosebumps because he's been able to frame things really, really well for me. And again, kind of hearing along the way with what he's done on the podcast and his shows. I'm excited about this book. I'm excited to get my hands on it and get through it.
Cool. Should we answer a couple more of these questions before we get to this?
The comment. Yep, reactive. It's definitely there for a reason. And then here. This is the only other what about the opinion bad habit to return pure entity and always use DTO instead?
Yeah, so I would have to. So again, at least in the example that I posted, somebody said you shouldn't return true entities. Again, I didn't have an entity there. I was just using an in-memory representation. So there is no persistence layer there, if you will. Um, yeah, we can dive into that one day. It really is, you know, there the data transfer objects are there to represent a piece of that entity. There are times where I want to see the whole thing, and you can basically add some annotations in there from like Jackson if you're marshaling, to JSON, or serializing and deserializing to JSON to say like I don't want to include these things. So it just depends.
It
There are
depends.
pros and cons to both, but
There's
I'm
not a
okay with it in certain
yeah.
cases. But you can certainly make the case that, hey, in certain situations, let's go ahead and use a
Yeah.
DTO instead of the actual entity.
It depends on what's in it, right?
Mhm.
One of because we can change where that filtering happens, right? Dan is also a big GraphQL expert, and he has a lot of content around that, where we can return the entity, but we can just not expose the things that we don't want exposed via the API. So there's different paradigms, different patterns that we're using now as applications mature and technology matures and things like GraphQL become more common. The need to have that DTO and all of the benefits that it provided in the long ago don't really provide as much benefit in the case where your architecture is different and implemented by something like GraphQL.
Cool. Is React, Spring Boot, and MySQL a good combination? Sounds like a great combination for sure.
Yeah, start.
Do you have some tips or patterns you use for customizing a library using injectable beans? Customizing Spring Security would be a good example. The problem is finding which beans to configure and replace.
I want to know
So
more.
I would need to know like what you're trying to customize in Spring
Yeah.
Security, because Spring Security gives you a lot of the tools out of the box to customize pretty much anything you need. So when we talk about like the Spring Security configuration, you're creating a new security filter chain bean and you can customize it there. You can add in a whole bunch of different types of filters into Spring Security to do almost anything you need to do. Um, I would suggest we did an episode while DaShaun was away with Daniel from the Spring. He's on both the Tanzu side and the Spring Security side. He has a really good video from Devox where it was like a 3-hour in-depth tutorial on Spring Security, and he went into creating some filters there. So just understanding how you can get in and customize Spring Security. I don't think you need to do the things that you think you're doing, but again, depending on what you're trying to do, let me know, Dale.
We've said it on the show many times. In my experience, where I think that, hey, it'd be really nice to have this thing. A lot of times, what I find is the Spring team, the Spring community has already done that thing. It'd be nice to have this option. So whenever I find myself up against the corner, like, oh man, if only I could do this thing, I really take a step back. I go to spring.io and I look at the docs and I look at the projects and the guides to look for those types of patterns.
Yeah, and especially with something like Spring Security that's been around as long as Spring, it's been through the ringer. Okay,
Right.
I see this other question coming in. I gotta look back to my bookshelf here because it's very important. Where is it?
Find it.
Oh man, I'm trying to help my buddy out. There it is. Somebody asked for a question. What's the best? Suggest a book to learn Reactive Spring. That's the actual title of this book, is Reactive Spring by the one and only Josh Long. This is, sure there's other books out here, but this would be my first go-to book. I love this book. I've read it probably 2.5 times now, and I'll probably have to read it a third time because the more I don't use it, the more I forget. So I need to go back through it some more soon.
Well done. Well done. That's the one. That's the right answer.
Cool. All right, let me get into this. So up on screen here, CodeMash. It is a really great conference here in Ohio. It's about an hour from me in a place called Sandusky, Ohio. DaShaun, have you ever been to Sandusky, Ohio?
I've never been.
Never been, huh? So there's a place called Cedar Point there, which some people in the States might be familiar with. Really big amusement park. Well, they have this really cool water park called Kalahari, not Calamari. And they have a conference there. And I was able to speak at it 2 years ago. That was the first time I was there. And this thing's been around like 12 years, 13 years. And I was just blown away. It was just a really great conference. Loved talking to people there. Wasn't there last year, but we were able to submit this workshop, and thankfully we got accepted. So this is a getting started with Spring. So if you know Java and you want to learn Spring, maybe you know a little bit of Spring, but you want to just kind of get back into it or going to get caught up, this is the workshop for you then. So there's the this is happening Wednesday, January 11th. So what I said at the beginning of this was DaShaun and I are big build in public fans. So we like to build things in public, get your opinion. We put together the agenda for this. Now, quite frankly, we could go in tomorrow and talk for 4 hours about Spring, but we want to be very careful about what we're going to get into. So that's why we're going to start with this agenda and then kind of refine from there. So
you pull it up. I'm going to throw up a couple of questions just so that we have them on the recording and we can come back to them.
Cool.
Yes, I'm just going to say yes. We will do an episode on reactive programming with Spring.
You know who we could probably have on?
I think I have a good idea. I'm going to answer this one real quick. Hexagonal architecture. We had our good friend Ted on a previous episode. I'll try to throw that link up there.
He has a course on it.
Yep. Is Spring authorization server?
Yes, it is.
The answer is yes.
Yes. 1.0 is out. And you can use it with Spring Boot 3. And every day I get a question from somebody on YouTube or on Twitter that says, when are you going to make a tutorial on authorization server? And it's coming. I'm just trying to find time to get to all this stuff. So right now our focus is on getting started with Spring Boot. So let me actually bump this up a little. So getting started with Spring, actually, and I think in the title for this, it's actually getting started with Spring, right? Because I don't want to make it's not just about Spring Boot. It is about Spring in general. So learn the fundamentals of Spring, build and deploy your first application. DaShaun and I were talking about this yesterday. We wanted to come up with a domain to kind of build this demo in, to talk about. This is very much going to be a practical hands-on workshop. We're going to have some slides at the beginning to cover some high-level stuff, but this is very much a follow along with us and build something. Again, the subtitle there is learn the fundamentals of Spring while you build and deploy something, right? DaShaun mentioned it earlier. He learns through doing stuff. Nobody wants to sit in a room for 4 hours and hear us lecture on Spring. It'll get pretty boring pretty quick. So we're both big runners, so we thought we'd build something along an activity tracker. So, hey, you want to track a run? I'm going to go ahead and log something. I may have something like a start and an end date, or a start and an end time. So maybe like a local date time. The distance, time, type. Type could be an enum. Hey, I'm running indoors or outdoors. Maybe I have a collection of shoes that I wear, and this is the shoe that I used today. An average pace could be calculated based on distance, start, finish. And then a title. Maybe today's Tuesday. I had a Tuesday evening run tonight. That's kind of the title for it. So that's the application. We can get more into that probably next week as we build this out. Today, we're really just kind of talking about the agenda. So I don't know about you guys, but whenever I'm building something, whether it's an article, a guide, a tutorial, a workshop that's going to be 4 hours, I got to start with some type of objectives. Like, what is someone who is taking this course, reading this article, what are they going to get out of it? And so we may have to tweak these, but right now, this is, hey, we're going to learn how to build a basic Spring Boot application. Along the way, we're going to learn a lot of the core fundamentals of Spring, things like dependency injection and everything that goes into that. A lot of web applications need to connect to a database. So let's learn how that works. And we're going to deploy a Spring Boot application into production. This thought of, so I'm going to clean this up later.
Yeah, dude. Yeah, type. We're working.
Build the rest.
Paul, yes. Spring, Flutter front end, absolutely. I think there's actually a Discord channel that I came across, and that's like the whole thing. Flutter with Spring. So yeah, I'll see if I can find that.
So cool. Those are my objectives and outcomes. Any changes or additions that you'd like to see there, DaShaun?
No, does that make sense? If we have to have some kind of domain, something. We wanted this workshop to be something that you can use. Something that like, hey, oh yeah, that's a thing. I could go and I could use that to start or be like a pattern to follow for some other project that's similar. Yep. Maybe it's not running, maybe it's books or DVDs. But having something that's usable, and then hopefully we're covering enough of the bases, that it's beneficial and it's worth holding on to. I want somebody to feel like, hey, I want to save this thing that I did and put it into a GitHub repo.
Cool. So prerequisites, who coming to this workshop, what should you know? What should you have? So you should have some beginner/intermediate Java experience. You don't need to be an expert, just some experience with Java. Experience with Java build tools. So we're going to use Maven, but you should understand what a Java build tool is, Maven or Gradle, how they work. And from a software standpoint, we need to let the potential students know what they need to bring. So they're going to bring their laptops with them. What should be on those laptops? We are saying, hey, I love IntelliJ IDEA. I'm actually using the latest version, 2022.3. That's what we're using. There's a free trial, a 30-day trial, so you could use that. There's a community edition. I do want to point out there are some limitations in the community edition when you're doing Spring development. But you can also use Visual Studio Code. You can also use Spring Tool Suite, whatever you do Java development with, whatever your tool of choice is.
Paul's asking, how are we going to cover deployment, like into a cloud? How are we going to cover that part of the section? What are we going to do?
So we'll get to it. We're not going to have a ton of time. So it's going to be some basics, and I'll show you when we get to the end. So kind of going to production is last.
Here's another good question, right? Like, this is excellent. I feel like, hey, we're talking to some of the questions here. Like, what is a Java build tool? Like, why do I need that?
When you go to start.spring.io and you create a new project, this is whether you do it here or whether you do it through the IDE. Your first selection that you need to make or use the default is this project type. And that could either be Gradle or Maven. So that is the build tool. And this solves the problem of having to manage the project kind of infrastructure, if you will. So with something like Maven, you just declare a dependency and it will get brought in for you. Same thing with Gradle, right? So now instead of like, I'm kind of dating myself here, but way back in the day, we used to create projects and throw a bunch of jar files in a lib folder and make sure it was on the class path and a whole bunch of fun stuff.
Right.
That's the alternative. This is a much more programmatic approach, a much better way of building software. So Maven and Gradle are a build tool in Java. Other languages have build tools. But those are the two big ones in the Java space.
Yeah. So another problem it solves is when I provide that POM file or that Gradle build file, I put that into my repository and it's got the versions. And then the build tool knows how to go and grab the artifacts that match that version. The alternative is if I have some shared repository somewhere of having all of those libraries in there, for you as a developer that wants to work on that, you've got to download all of those libraries. And some projects can be massive, right? Depending on what you're working on. And downloading those binary files over the internet is still, painful. So you have this easier, cleaner repository that doesn't have a bunch of binary code in it. And you've got a mechanism for finding and resolving those dependencies.
Cool. Great question, though.
Yes. In my head, I'm thinking, hey, yeah, we'll land in a container, and that container will be the artifact that we deploy somewhere. Spring Cloud, we're going to probably not be able to get into Spring Cloud and microservices in this, right? As a getting started with, we talked about that, but 4 hours seems like a long time, but
it's not.
It's not really when we're trying to.
That would be day 2. So even if we had 8 hours, I wouldn't say we'd get into that because we'd probably get into more security and production stuff. That is definitely like day 2 stuff. So agenda. We're just going to quickly go over who we are, what is office hours. We want to get more people into this show to ask their questions like you guys are. We'll talk about what the agenda is, prerequisites. I think really starting with, hey, what is Spring? Why should I care about this? Because Spring isn't just for building web applications. You can use it to build so many things. What's the motivation for me to want to use Spring? And I think giving someone motivation to use a tool is really the place to start, because now things start turning in their heads and going, oh yeah, like it can do that. Okay, that's something that I do at work with this other tool. I can probably use Spring for that. So setting the groundwork with some motivation. You're going to hear Spring Framework and Spring Boot when you get into this world. Why are there 2 different things? What are the differences? So let's talk through those real quick. As DaShaun mentioned earlier, Spring.io is a great place to start. We want to point people to, hey, if you want to find the reference documentation, here it is. If you want to find the guides to do a specific thing, here it is. And look at all these other projects in the ecosystem in the Spring world. If you need to get security or this or that, there's probably a project for that. And the Tanzu Developer Center we love because, as you just saw with our coworkers guide, there is a bunch of really great information over there as well. So that's kind of what we were thinking on the, a little bit more on the introduction. We'll just, again, this is kind of where our slides are. So we'll have some slides at the beginning. What are some Spring Boot features? Like why do you need Spring Boot if you told us that Spring Boot is basically for building Spring Framework applications? There are 3 big features of Spring Boot. So the starters, auto configuration, simplified deployment. And then, hey, what are we going to build? We're going to show them the application that we're going to build. Here's the GitHub repository. Here's the source code for what you're going to build today if you get lost. Here are the slides, because those will be in Markdown format, so those will be in the same repo. And then also, here's a list of resources. When you leave here today, here are some things that we want to share with you so that you can go back and take a look.
This is a great question. Can we get this document? We should just, we can throw this document in and take PRs. Like, are we on the right track? This question makes me feel like we're on the right track for like, hey, here's what you need to get started with Spring Boot.
Right. So I don't want to share this exact document out. But
once we get into a good format and put it in Markdown somewhere.
At the very least, we will get this out maybe next week. Yeah, or in the show notes. Yep. We will get this out, some version of it. So that is our introduction. Yes, we are going to ask that exact question to you guys because we're struggling with that as well. So that is, believe it or not, we're going to pack all that into 30 minutes that we think. So we also haven't rehearsed this yet. So these numbers in the section here are just kind of guesses and what we want to try and stick to, but we haven't tested this out yet. So after that, we're going to have a really quick getting started. So you go to start.spring.io, we create a new project, we talk about all the things on that screen. because if you haven't used it before, there are some things that we can talk about, like dependencies. And I always, I always try to make the analogy of, hey, I'm going to the grocery store to create a meal that, I'm having this dinner party over, and these are the things I want to make. I need my ingredients, right? So I have this list of things that I know that I need. So as I'm walking down the aisle, I can just grab the stuff, put it in my cart. It's the same with that dependency list, right? Like if I'm going into this knowing what I'm going to build, then I can pick the dependencies that I want. So we'll talk about that. We'll talk about examining the pom.xml. Hey, what are these Spring Boot starter things? How are versions managed, different dependency versions managed for us? A main app, looks like I got a spelling. Application. We'll talk about the main application class, that Spring Boot application annotation. And then, hey, how do I start this application, whether it's in my IDE, via a build tool? How can I test this out in a browser or via command line?
I think this has to be one of your fans. For those of you that don't know, Dan has an amazing channel on YouTube, and yes, a lot of folks come in just to see Dan.
Oh, please. Okay. Anything with getting started? Do you like that?
I do. Do we want to touch on some of the the runners? Like, hey, on startup, I want to do these things. Some of those different options that we have in the startup, or
I do. I don't think we want to do that now because we haven't given them a reason yet, right?
Yep.
So if we just throw that at you now, then it's like, why are you telling me this now? I've just learned how to run the application, right? Yes, exactly.
Thank you.
I'm here for DaShaun. DaShaun teaches me every day. So, okay. So the next section I have is for like an hour core fundamentals and features. There's a lot here. This is the one that we need to test out. I think this is going to run longer. Each of these sections may run longer than an hour, so we may have to cut some things back. But okay, we've created an application, we've started it. Now, how do we go ahead and structure some code? Talk about, splitting this up into layers. So I heard hexagonal architecture earlier. We won't get too much into theory there, just like, hey, you may see this split up into different ways. We talk about Spring Bean. So we create a new class in our application. When I hear the word bean, what is that? I like to talk about this right away because I think for new people to Spring, when you hear things like Spring Beans and application context and dependency injection and inversion of control, you're just like, this is like too much being thrown at me. Mm-hmm. But when you break it down, like a bean is just a class that you've created that you've told Spring about, right? So when you do that, then it makes it a little less scary. So we'll talk about beans and how you can create them, adding one of those annotations to one of your classes or using that bean annotation. We'll talk about application context, dependency injection, and inversion of control. Configuration, so externalized configuration, how to set things in application.properties, profiles, logging, and dev tools.
One of the other things that I notice here is like a lot of what we've had questions in Spring Office Hours and other channels. We're trying to cover those bases. So if you've got things that are on your mind and you're learning, like ask us. And yeah, we'll see if maybe that needs to fit in here as well. Like here, like, hey, on deployment, can we do some CI/CD? Spring Boot also provides some of these cool tools that'll build your container image so you can deploy things to AWS. And maybe we could get into that, on the path to production at the end of this. Hello, Tutor Ted.
I knew this was coming. I knew it was coming. We just don't. It was on my initial agenda, and then DaShaun and I started talking, and we're just like, what are we going to cut out to get this? And there just isn't anything we can cut out yet.
It'll be there. One of the other things that we talked about was providing like an API first and like, hey, here's what we're going to develop. Here's the API, and using that as kind of that test harness. Like, hey, are we checking the box? Are we matching? So we could also provide that as well.
And putting that stuff into the repo so that even if we don't cover all of that, hey, when you leave with the final code, you at least get some examples of that.
So we covered the prerequisites early. Like, we think that this is a course that really you just need to understand Java, like understand the JVM, have used the JVM, and you should probably understand the build tools. Even though it's like somebody that has never used Maven or Gradle might have a little bit of a learning curve, but most of the stuff that we're going to do with those tools is pretty basic. So you don't have to have a deep knowledge of them. So even that, we think that this is a beginner course.
Yep. Yeah, this is definitely geared towards beginners. So, okay, so that's core fundamentals. Hopefully we can we need to get that done in an hour. So when we do a dry run, we'll figure out what we can actually talk about, what we can include. And again, this is a live coding. So when we have these bullet points here, this is us actually like writing some code and then talking through the things that we want to talk about. And hopefully, the attendees are live coding, you're coding along with us. So we have some built-in some time to some people might run into an issue. We got to help people out. So that's all in the back of our head as well. Cool. So that's core fundamentals. What we're going to build is a REST API. And to do so, we need to talk about Spring Web or Spring MVC. So we'll get into just a real quick introduction to what model view controller is. You may have used it in another language or framework. Hey, we can put static resources into our Spring Boot app, so we can have like an index.html if we want. But the bulk of this is, okay, we're going to build out a CRUD REST API. So in our case, we're going to build out some CRUD screens for being, not screens, not UI yet, but the ability to create, read, update, delete, list all of the activities in the database, right? So when I add a new run, I want to be able to display that on screen. I want to be able to edit, delete, update, all the things that you would expect in a CRUD screen. So with that, we're going to talk through all the annotations that you're going to come across when building out, say, a REST controller. We're going to build out those CRUD methods. So we'll talk about, everything that goes into that. And then how do you go ahead and test that out, whether it's from the command line or a tool like Postman. Hey, if you're doing this from a front end, we have to talk about this thing called CORS, cross-origin resource sharing, which is something I'm sure everybody's hit at one point. And then if we have time, we talk about a little bit of error handling and data validation. I don't suspect we have much time to go into that stuff because, again, this is only an hour. So
I think by providing the API first and kind of putting the guardrails around what we're doing, I think that'll help.
Yeah.
But we also talked about like, hey, the front end part. One of the things that I've done in the past is like, hey, I'm going to provide the front end in the API, and you're going to learn how to build the guts, right? Implement the API.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's important. The muscle memory from typing out those API methods and using those different annotations is important. So that's the second major hour. So we're at 30 minutes in the intro, 15 minutes. So we're at a 45, 1 hour and 45 minutes. We're at 2 hours and 45 minutes. Now we haven't even taken into account breaks either. We can build in some breaks. Next, we get to data. So here's where this gets a little bit interesting. So we're going to talk real quickly about Spring Data. What is it? We'll go into kind of a high-level overview. We'll talk about JPA and JDBC, probably two of the more popular projects in Spring Data. JPA being the most popular project under the Spring Data umbrella. In my opinion, JDBC a little bit lot less of a learning curve to getting started. So if most of the students or attendees have not used any like Hibernate or ORM before, JPA in itself could be a 4-hour workshop, right? So this is where, but I feel like we need one of them, because one of the powers of Spring Data is you get all these repositories out of the box that, hey, we don't have to mess around with writing SQL for create, read, update, delete list, because again, that would take way too long in a 4-hour workshop. So we need those repositories. So we have to pick one of those. So the question then becomes, which one do we use? JPA, more popular, probably going to be really confusing if we throw it at you in 15 minutes. JDBC, less popular, but I love it. So
We got a +1.
yeah.
JDBC from Ted.
Yeah. So, and then we'll use the H2 in memory DB. We'll in DB quickly talk about like, hey, if you want to move away from that, if you want to use something like Postgres, you can. Just how easy it is to connect to a database in Spring and get up and running with Spring Data, I think is the highlight, and really gives people that wow factor. Like, wow, this is so easy to use. I just configure a couple things and I'm talking to a database and I have all the things. So that's kind of my thought there.
Yes, Paul brings up, hey, are we going to have branches for different sections in case we
Yep.
fall behind? Yes, that's the plan. Thanks. That's a good reminder.
Yeah, really good one. Then if we have time, we'll talk about like, hey, if depending on which we go with, so JPA is going to, you can configure it to kind of write your tables out for you. If we're using JDBC, we'll have to have like a DDL script. So we'll probably not write that out together. We'll just have one. We'll show you that you can go ahead and run that. Populate a database programmatically. So back into your hooks. So we can use things like the application event listener, the command line runner to go ahead and populate the database.
So this is a problem for me. My problem is I can't get my brain to stop before the thing reaches production. And again, this is a course on getting started. So in my head, there's all of these other things that I want you to do after this course. Should we add some of that? Should we add some like, hey, from here, go and do these things? Should we add a section that kind of talks about some of like the 15 factors and security and containerization and platform? Should we add some of that or leave it? And I know it's a personal thing. I'm always wanting to go forward, but
yeah, I think we could add more, especially the tip about adding tests everywhere and maybe like a little bit of documentation about that. Part 2, yeah,
definitely a part 2.
So that's data. We had talked about Spring security. The more that we got to putting this agenda together, I just don't think we can even touch Spring security.
I think it should wait. I feel like it could wait. This is about, hey, let's get it working.
It's just too much,
get things moving, because it can change a lot of the details all the way down.
Yeah. And I'd rather spend more time getting this thing into production than Spring security. So I'm going to just go ahead and delete this right now. I don't think we need this.
So this Spring to production, some of the things that we can address, like talk about the value of the parent POM and the projects being working together, as a part of the guarantee of being Spring Boot. We can talk about the containerizing and using build packs and getting the best and from the upstream, the best process for building those containers and all of the security that implies as making this production ready, kind of all of those, the benefits, like, hey, some easy things that give us a lot of value on our way to production.
Yeah, and I think we mentioned it at the beginning of the course or the workshop, saying, hey, remember the 3 kind of highlights or features of Spring Boot? One of them was simplified deployment. So let's revisit that. We give you all the tools that you need to easily, quick, we can create an Uber jar. We can run it from the command line if we want. Hey, we can build a container if the hosting provider that we're trying to move this to only supports containers. Guess what? You don't have to write Docker files. Nobody wants to be in that business.
For those of you that don't know, Docker files are bad. I'm going to say it. If you find yourself editing a Docker file in 2022, just take a step back and just think about how you got here. Containers are definitely the way to go, but Docker files is a problem I don't want any of you to have to deal with.
Yeah, and since we are going to be on Spring Boot 3, we'll try and highlight some Spring Boot 3. I am going to take a note of that. Highlight some Spring Boot 3 features whenever we're in something. So, we may be talking about Spring Data repositories, and I'll mention like, hey, there's this list cred repository that's in Spring Boot 3. One of the things, obviously, is generating native images using GraalVM. So hopefully we can talk about that towards the end as well as another option for, as you know, those different workloads. If we're moving to something like the cloud or serverless, we can go ahead and use GraalVM native images.
This is a good question. And I'm going to say that typically the security is added on at the end. And I'm going to say that because I've seen it referenced even in the 15 factor. That's kind of where it's at. But it needs to be considered early on. Typically, I like to include the Spring Security project out of the box when I'm in my start Explorer today. I want to make sure it's there. So I'll see it in my palm every time I look at my palm. It's going to create a password for everything that I do if I'm running locally and testing locally, so that it's on my mind. And I think that's a safe step for anybody that's doing Spring Boot development. Go ahead and add that Spring Security dependency to your project just to keep it top of mind from the beginning.
And Spring Security is secure by default, which is a really great approach to building your application. So because it's secure by default, you can take that same approach. So if you override the default configuration, you should take that same approach. Everything is secure. Let me build out one resource. So I'm going to build out this activity controller in this application. Okay, let me just start to open up the things that I need to open up. And now everything else is still secure by default. So I think that's a good approach, including it right away.
We've had a lot of good questions, a lot of good feedback today. I feel like we have a good start, a good outline here.
Yeah, can't cover everything, but generating a project that gets deployed would be a nice end goal. Yeah, for sure. Even if you can't get, we're not going to have the time to get into all the intricacies that go into deploying a project, right? But if you just, it becomes much more tangible when I can get something out there. So even if I could, Ted, you introduced me to Railway. Here's a Railway that has a free tier. Go ahead and just connect your GitHub repo that you created today and get it out there. So yeah. Oh, and guess what? I got a video on that if you need to go do that. So hopefully, even if we can't get through it, we'll have some resources to give everyone too. So cool. That's our agenda. Now things are going to change. Like I said, we have not built in breaks yet. And we know that these times are just estimates. So we're going to start rehearsing this soon and, probably trim some things down a little. But that's what we want to cover. So we'd love to know your thoughts on that.
Yeah. In my head, I still have this Spring Cloud Pipelines concept. What does it look like from when I create the thing to when it gets to production, that path? What does my pipeline look like? We had that question about what does my CI/CD look like? It doesn't have to be massive. It can be as easy as a GitHub Actions or a choreographer on a Raspberry Pi. Production looks different for everybody. And there's tons of products that would love to sell you something to make your pipelines better. But the idea of what does it take to get from thought to production and what are all those things? There's a lot of other topics that we could cover here in Spring Office Hours. We're trying to answer the questions. And there's a lot of topics that, hey, it would be nice to come back and share some content on in the future. So yeah, thank you for all of the questions. We want to know where your head's at, what you're facing. One of the things that we left out of here, I'm comfortable with it, is the idea that I think that the balance of RDBMS to non-RDBMS to NoSQL stuff, I think that balance is starting to shift. Definitely the traditional RDBMS is still the winner by a long shot, but the trend is heading, I think, the other way. And I was like, we need to put that in. No, there's a ton of topics that we could cover outside of this course. We don't have to get everything in here. And I'm even more confident today after the questions that we had before we even talked on the agenda. And after it, I feel like, yep, we've got a nice thing. I know that my problem is, knowing where to stop. And I think we got a good box.
Yeah. Yeah. Cool. I'm excited. Which is the best test containers deployment will give us some more confidence.
I have a project. I did a blog post on test containers and how I'm using test containers with Spring Boot 3. And in the past, the jar file was what was kind of the artifact that I was delivering to my middleware or whatever. But today, the container, it's that image, the Docker image, that OCI image. That's the thing that we're using, and that's the thing that we're taking across the different environments. And I have a pattern that I've been using where in my project, I'm actually running my tests. Then I build the container and I run tests against that container. Like, these are the things that I expect to be exposed on port 8080. And these are some of the examples that I want. And then I also do the native image as a part of my test suite. And I can hit that native image to make sure that the native image is behaving the same way that my JVM JIT image is. So yeah, expect to see something on that real soon, but I've got a couple articles up there.
You are too kind. Thank you. Cool. Well, I'm excited. So again, I think the plan is next week we will continue on this. We will maybe just start to build some of the application out and talk through some of our thoughts. And again, we're going to go back and kind of refine this agenda, and we'll share with you in public kind of what we discussed. So
yeah, there's JitterTed.
Yeah.
There's also, I don't know if you use it, JitterTed, that idea. There's a pattern that you can say, hey, as I'm doing my Spring Boot run, I just attach that test container while I'm running it locally. I've done that. So yeah, it is.
But again, we will teach H2 because that's the path to least resistance to getting started. So
awesome.
Cool.
Good. I mean, just going through the agenda, explaining the agenda, man, that was a lot of time. 4 hours is not a lot of time.
Like you said at the beginning of this, you said 4 hours may seem like a long time, but no, it's not. Not when you have to cover all this material and live code and answer questions. I think we have way more than what we are going to actually be able to cover. So should be fun. I'm excited.
That's the position we want to be in. We want to have.
Yes.
It would be great if everybody's like, "Oh, this is easy," and then we can go and do our 15 factor or go into production or adding security. That would be a wonderful. I would love to have that outcome.
Yeah.
But we'll be ready.
Cool. All right. Well, I know one of the things I keep getting asked is like, when is the next Tanzu, or when is the next Spring Office Hours? How can I again, head over to the Tanzu Developer Center. There is a page for Spring Office Hours on there. That is the best place to go. You see our Twitter handles up there at The Real Dan Vega, at DaShaun. We're always kind of posting that information out on Twitter or LinkedIn, when we have the actual show scheduled. So please follow us there. Time frame for
time frame. We're here every week at this time.
Yes,
that's our current agenda.
Tuesdays 3:30 EDT. We will be there for the next 2 weeks, like I said, and then we'll probably be off for the rest of the year. So cool. Well, thanks again for everyone. Thank you to everyone for showing up, for asking questions, for making this interactive. If we just got here and stared at each other for an hour, it would not be as fun as it is. having you guys participate. So thank you so much. And we will see you next week.
Awesome.
Have a good one.
Take care.